Hi, everyone. My name is April Yee, and I'm one of your volunteer organizers and the VP of Finance for the Alumni Council. On behalf of the Alumni Association, I'd like to welcome you to our monthly speaker series, Slugs and Steins, Lectures from UC Santa Cruz. For those who are new, our Slugs and Steins series engages a UCSC member in discussion with you, the local community of Santa Cruz, and our extended community online. Co-hosting with me this evening is David Hansen, another volunteer organizer and a previous member of the Alumni Council. So the great physicist Richard Feynman once said, "Everything is interesting if you go into it deeply enough." And if you agree with him, you're one of us. We want it to feel just like you're at UCSC among the redwoods, sitting in class, but without homework or tests. And I'd like to share the UCSC land acknowledgement right now. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. And before we get started, we'd like to take a poll to get to know our audience and where you're tuning in from. So a poll will pop up and we'll share the results after we've given you a moment to respond. Okay. Now you should be able to see the responses and the results of our polls and who is in the room with you. So we have a lot of individuals here, lots of folks from Santa Cruz County and the Bay Area and California tonight. All right. Well, tonight our topic springs from a new UCSC Humanities course called The Curse of the Mummy, co-taught by tonight's speakers. And it combines analysis of 19th century Egyptology's transformation of ancient Egypt into a European fantasy with study of ancient Egyptian culture itself. Thus, we will be raising our steins with not one, but two guests, Renée Fox and Elaine Sullivan. So Renée Fox is Associate Professor of Literature, the Jordan Stern Presidential Chair for Dickens and 19th Century Studies, co-director of the Dickens Project, and co-director of the Center for Monster Studies at UC Santa Cruz. Elaine Sullivan is an Assistant Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Sullivan is an Egyptologist and a digital humanist whose work focuses on applying new technologies to ancient cultural materials. And tonight, if you have questions for Renée or Elaine, please type them into Zoom's Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And you don't need to wait until the last minute. You can type them in at any time. And if you see someone else's question that you like, you can upvote it. And David or I will have it asked sooner. And we'll wait until the end of tonight's presentation to ask those questions. And this evening's talk is being recorded. So in a day or two, you'll be able to find it on the UCSC Arts Lectures and Entertainment YouTube channel. And that way you'll get a thank you email from us and the link will be there as well. Okay, does everyone have their steins? Great, I've got your slugs, Renée Fox and Elaine Sullivan.
Hi there, everybody. I'm Renée, and Elaine is in the box next to me or under me. I just wanted to make one quick correction. Elaine is an associate professor in the history department, not an assistant professor. She has done an enormous amount of work. So our plan today is just to talk a little bit about about the course in general, to talk about how it relates to our very different but somehow also intertwined research projects, and then to kind of step you through the 10 weeks of the class, and the things that we did with our students over the course of the last 10 weeks, the texts we've read, some of the ideas that we were working with, and then open things up for questions at the end. Um, Elaine is going to be in charge of slides because she is much better at that than I am.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing. And Renee, can you let me know if you're seeing the right slides?
Yes, I am seeing the right slide.
Great.
Okay, fabulous. So this course that we developed explores aspects of ancient Egypt that exploded into the popular Western imagination in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The mummy. Who doesn't love mummies? Who doesn't think mummies are weird and cool and interesting? So the aim of this course was to look both at ancient Egyptian culture itself. Elaine is an Egyptologist by trade, and the way the 19th century European imagination transformed Egypt into something both imaginary and something political. So we combined our collaborative expertise, the expertise of an actual real life Egyptologist and the expertise of a Victorian studies scholar, that's my area, and we looked at how and why the ancient past can become integral to contemporary identity, society, and aesthetics. So, in its study of Egyptian mummies, the course ended up moving back and forth in time and back and forth in discipline, pairing ancient history, meaning the actual practices, historical contexts, and religious meanings for mummification of human bodies in ancient Egypt, with reception studies. The ways that 19th century British literature, art, and media borrowed from and reimagined the figure of the Egyptian mummy for their own cultural and political ends. So we thought we'd just spend a little bit of time introducing ourselves before we went into the course, and we made these slides in which we put up things that were important to us. So the things on my slide are a picture of a whole bunch of copies of Dracula, all of the copies of Dracula that I have in my house. Another photo of me from the 2023 Festival of Monsters, which is a monster studies conference hosted by the new UCSC Center for Monster Studies. My love of baking things that are monster and gothic shaped, and the cover of my recently published book. So I specialize in 19th century British and Irish literature, and I particularly focus on the Gothic and monsters and how they relate to ideas of history in the 19th century. As April said, I'm the co-director of the UCSC Center for Monster Studies, as well as the co-director of the Dickens Project. And the book that you can see the cover for on your screen was published in 2023. It's called The Necromantics, and it's about reanimated corpses in Victorian literature and how they can show us that ghosts and haunting aren't the only ways to think about the persistence of the past in the 19th century. And the way it relates to this course is that the last chapter of the book is focused on a mummy novel by Bram Stoker, writer of my beloved Many Draculas. And mummies in the Victorian imagination were a really key part of the research that I've been doing for the last several years on that book.
Great. And I am the course Egyptologist, and I'm also an archaeologist. And I've worked at a number of temple and necropolis or cemetery sites in Egypt, including the Temple of Mut at Karnak and the Saqqara Pyramid site near Cairo, for which I published an open access born digital monograph with 3D models reimagining the site of Saqqara called Constructing the Sacred. And that was with Stanford University Press in 2020. And my current research project is on the movement of antiquities in the late 19th and early 20th century from the site of Saqqara. And that's tracing the sale of artifacts as well as whole pieces of architecture that were sold to various countries outside of Egypt, including US museums and US universities, including our own Bay Area schools of UC Berkeley and Stanford University. So in designing this class, both of us realized that we were thinking about mummies in ancient Egypt um, in different ways. We've been talking together about these things for a long time because we're both colleagues, but also friends. And we realized that we were approaching questions related to Egypt in different disciplinary ways. Renée from the point of view of a literature scholar, myself from the point of view of a historian and archaeologist. And one of the things that we found really interesting talking about this material is that we're looking at the same content, but through with different themes, with thinking through the archive of materials in different ways. And so one of our goals for teaching this class was to think about those interdisciplinary conversations and the ways in which we, from our own disciplines, are approaching this material in different and divergent ways.
So one of the outcomes of the many conversations that we have been having was that we realized that thinking about mummies in the 19th century Western imagination was going to be a really, really excellent way to demonstrate to students how different disciplines approach the same texts and um, types of knowledge from those texts in complementary ways, but not exactly the same ways. So, we were excited to take all of these texts and kind of demonstrate through our lectures and our thinking the different things that we were getting out of these texts and the different reasons that they were important to us. And so we thought that mummies would be a really great way to showcase both interdisciplinary conversations, but also the specificity of disciplinary methods. So we wanted the students to be able to see the way disciplines both intertwine and produce different ways of thinking, different kinds of knowledge, different ways of reading.
So we thought we would just take you through some of the major themes of the class and what the students were talking about with us, what kind of literature we were reading. And so you can get a sort of quick overview of the 10 weeks of the class in 30 minutes. We started the class in week 1 asking the question, why are the British so interested in Egypt in the 19th century? Where does this mummy literature come from? What interactions between the British and the Egyptians are the foundation for the development of all of these stories? So why was the British public fascinated with Egypt? And together we read a number of articles talking about the economic, social, and political overlap between the expanding British Empire and Egypt in the 19th century. And there were a number of important types of economic interactions at this time, including Britain's financial involvement, in the construction of the Suez Canal in the 1860s and onward. And then in the 1880s, the British invade Egypt and set up what scholars call a veiled protectorate. So a colonial state apparatus where Britain administered and controlled the finances of Egypt with the goal of keeping the Suez Canal open and collecting a financial debt that the Egyptian state owed to Britain and France. We also talked about the fact that British interest was neither limited to economics nor politics. In the second half of the 19th century, increasing numbers of British citizens came into Egypt as part of the new phenomenon of what we would call global package travel, like Thomas Cook's tours. And this made international travel accessible to more than just the rich and titled. And tourists went on Nile steamship cruises, they visited temples and tombs. British authors wrote memoirs of their journeys, like Amelia Edwards' best-selling A Thousand Miles Up the Nile. And tourists collected antiquities to take back with them to Britain as souvenirs of their trips. So it's not only soldiers and politicians who went to Egypt, but regular people from Britain went there as well. And they experienced this very different landscape and this very different culture firsthand. And so they brought that interest and experience back with them and spread that back into the British homeland.
So, on the literary side, as we were learning about all of that history, we also spent week one looking at early manifestations of European writers like Percy Shelley and Théophile Gautier imagining Egypt. In Shelley's case, in the sonnet that you see on your screen, Ozymandias from 1818, and in Gautier's case, in an essay that was attached to his very popular novel, The Romance of the Mummy, that fancifully describes Egypt back to life. So we began talking about a number of formal and thematic ideas in this first week that we were going to return to over and over again throughout our readings in the class. We talked a lot about Edward Said's concept of Orientalism as a Western way of imagining the East as something other and as subject to Western power and control, and the way that Orientalist ideas manifested in the literary text that we were reading. We talked about Egypt as an idea and as a romantic symbol instead of an actual geographical place. We talked about Egypt representing both eternal grandeur and at the same time the destructive power of time and decay, grandeur and the fall of empires. And we ended up talking a lot about frame narratives. And you can see in the very first lines to Shelley's poem, I met a traveler from an antique land who said, and then the rest of the poem is not the voice of the speaker of the poem, but is the voice of this traveler. So we talked about this kind of frame narrative, about preoccupations with historical transmission and storytelling, and we talked about reanimation as a formal technique as well as a plot point. How do these texts about Egypt bring Egypt back to life in their language, in their structure, as well as kind of thinking about reanimated mummies or reanimated Egyptian antiquities as a kind of plot subject matter?
We read a number of pieces that talked about a particular 19th century phenomenon, the mummy unrolling. And British collectors and tourists brought more than just shabtis and artifacts home with them. They also collected human remains. And we learned how this collection practice actually had a much older history in the medieval period, where Europeans would use bitumen as a medicinal ingredient, and this led to the collecting and grinding up of mummified bodies in hopes of accessing that bitumen material. But in the 19th century, mummified remains from Egypt were taken back to the UK as well as to the US and Europe, and they were commoditized. These bodies were used or consumed through the unwrapping process. And the bodies were unwrapped in public settings for both the point of sort of medical examination, but also for a form of spectacle and entertainment for public crowds.
So, in tandem with beginning to talk about Europeans unrolling, commodifying, and displaying mummies in the 19th century, we also moved from those early 19th century texts about ideas of Egypt to mid and late 19th century stories that were about mummies specifically. And I've put a few of the titles up on the screen. So we discussed a Louisa May Alcott story, Lost in a Pyramid or The Mummy's Curse, in which an English woman becomes comatose as the result of her fiance violating the tomb of an ancient Egyptian sorcerer. We read a story by Justin Huntley McCarthy, in which ancient Egypt and a mummy princess are somehow mysteriously transplanted into a house in a kind of crappy part of London. And we read an Arthur Conan Doyle story, in which an Egyptian mummy becomes a tool of violence for an English Oxford student. These stories, very different though they are, with a similar focus, of course, though, on mummies, allowed us to continue talking about frame tales and the transmission of stories that we began in our first week, and also introduced several new themes that would be threads throughout our course readings. The uncanniness and danger of transplanting Egypt onto British soil, and of making Egyptian tombs and British houses somehow interchangeable spaces. We talked about the potential blowback of imagining ancient Egyptian things and bodies as tools of Western power instead of as subjects in their own right. We talked about how often mummy stories violate women's bodies, sexualize women's bodies, and imagine women's bodies as interchangeable objects of male violence. And related to this, we had our first introduction to mummy unrolling as a potentially erotic phenomenon. We see that in Louisa May Alcott's story, and that's something that returns in some of the things we read later in the quarter.
We then spent a week looking at the fascinating 19th century exhibits that introduced the British public to ancient Egypt. And we investigated how the British imagined Egypt in Belzoni's exhibit on the tomb of King Seti I at the Egyptian Hall. And that's the exterior of that is shown in the upper right slide that says Bullock's Museum. And we also looked at the Egyptian court at the Crystal Palace and, of course, the British Museum. And the authors of our readings talked about the ways in which British imperial interests manifested in these spaces. And we looked at how the British visitor experienced these spaces in ways that both aligned with, but also challenged the messages designed by the exhibit creators.
Elaine, before you go to the next slide, will you talk a little bit about the Egyptian inscription at the Crystal Palace?
Yeah. So one of the things that my students found most fascinating was this hieroglyphic inscription, which was inscribed here on the sort of architrave of this imagined temple space at the Crystal Palace. And hieroglyphs had been translated by this point. They'd been first, the code was cracked in the 1820s by Jean-François Champollion. So at this point, people could read hieroglyphs. And so the British had a text translated into Egyptian, and then they wrote that on this temple. And this text explicitly writes Queen Victoria into hieroglyphs and names her as, I believe, the ruler of the seas. So this very strange melding together of both past and present British queen, and they put her name in an Egyptian cartouche, effectively making her an Egyptian queen. So this very interesting sort of blending or melding of past and present and British and Egyptian.
So we accompanied this discussion of actual exhibitions of Egypt across the 19th century with a discussion of 19th century museum literature. And we talked quite broadly about the ways this genre of literature troubles the various ideologies of 19th century museums. When Elaine was talking about the British Museum especially, but also the Crystal Palace and the various other museums that were displaying Egypt, we talked about the museum as a representation of Western imperial power. We talked about the museum as an institution that tries to maintain social order, especially by kind of allowing visitors in the museum to gaze at each other and keep an eye on each other as much as they're keeping an eye on the things that they're looking at in cases. And we talked about the museum as a space of celebratory nationalist spectacle, that the museum could be a place where people from all different classes of British society could come together, could look at various materials from other cultures, and could kind of think themselves a national community, both in their ability to appreciate and in their recognition of difference from the cultures that were on display in front of them. So when we were talking about museum literature, we were talking about the idea that if the ideology of museums revolves around creating order, whether it's social, political, historical, scientific, or aesthetic order, then literature about museums often fantasizes about the breakdown of that order. And you can see an image up at the top of your screen from the 2017 movie The Mummy, in which the Natural History Museum in London is getting blown up. And museums get blown up, they fall down, they get damaged, quite often in museum literature in the 19th century, or, in this case, museum-ish literature that moves into the 21st century. So after talking about museum literature more generally, we move specifically to talking about Dante Gabriel Rossetti's mid-century poem called The Burden of Nineveh, and there's one small stanza of it on your screen. So this poem, even though it focuses on Assyrian rather than ancient Egyptian antiquities, it does mention mummies. That's the stanza I put up. And we talked about how this poem uses these Oriental antiquities, even if they're mostly not Egyptian, to express ambivalence about several aspects of museums, about the ways museums collapse different times and cultures into one another, about the anxieties the poem expresses about the British Empire falling, like these other cultures did, and becoming little more than a ruin to be picked over by future archaeologists. We talked about the future indistinguishability between Britain and all of these Eastern cultures that we see represented in this poem. And we talked finally about the poem's debate with itself, about whether it's more ethical to think about the antiquities in museums as objects of historical transmission or as ahistorical works of art. And the poem kind of gave us access to all of these different questions and ideas, and that allowed us to think about, how mummy literature and how museum literature, specifically about Egypt, also negotiates a lot of these questions. Then in week 4, we began our discussion of Bram Stoker's 1903 mummy novel, The Jewel of Seven Stars, which is the novel that I talk about in my book and that I've been kind of obsessed with for many, many years. And this is a text that brings together many of the preoccupations that we see or that we had seen spread across the other mummy stories that we'd been reading in the first few weeks of class. In our first week on this novel, we talked about the ways it's playing with and disrupting several late 19th century fictional genres, and I put some examples of those up on the screen. The detective novel, you can see that in The Sign of Four by Arthur Conan Doyle. The Imperial Gothic Romance, that's the King Solomon's Mines novel by H. Rider Haggard. The reverse colonization monster novel, Stoker's own Dracula, and the ghost story. And I put some ghost stories. The last image is a picture of a book called Hauntings, a collection of ghost stories by Vernon Lee. We also, in this first week on Stoker, talked about Stoker as an Irish rather than an English novelist, and about how reading the novel might change when we understand the history of Ireland as a colony of the British Empire, and the ways in which, at the beginning of the 20th century, Ireland and Egypt were both mounting campaigns of cultural nationalism and bids for independence from British control. And there was a lot of intersection between Irish and Egyptian nationalists at the moments that Stoker was writing this mummy novel. So we didn't end up spending much time in the rest of the class talking about Ireland or talking about Stoker as an Irish writer. But this initial conversation set us up to read Jewel as a critique of British imperial practice and power instead of as an endorsement of it.
Many of the authors that of the mummy literature we read for our class drew on the latest research coming out of Egypt in the late 19th century and then remixed it and reimagined it to work for their narratives. And one of the reimaginings of Egyptian history that was particularly interesting to me was Stoker's inclusion of a female king named Terah in the Jewel of Seven Stars. So in the book, Terah dresses as a male pharaoh. She's buried in a rock tomb in the cliffs of the desert, and her memory is intentionally erased by her successors for transgressing certain social norms in the book. And we, together with the students, looked at Stoker's writing of this female king and saw how it was based on historical information about the female Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut. And we looked at how modern historians have been able to learn more about her very unusual life and position in the more than 100 years since Stoker wrote the 1903 book. And Hatshepsut did indeed depict herself in her statuary in both female, male, and hybridized clothing, with also female, male, and hybridized body type. And she built an elaborately carved memorial temple and was buried with her father in the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. And her successor, her stepson Thutmose III, had her name and image erased from monuments across Egypt. And so we looked at ways that Stoker also took artistic license with Egyptian history, and that he didn't feel bound to make his story fully grounded in Egyptology, but he used his literary imagination and interwove it together with this historical content. And we also in class talked about Egyptian curses, an idea that permeates our British literature and absolutely still shows up in all of our modern mummy films. And so we looked at the historical context for Egyptian cursing. And indeed, the Egyptians did have curses. And so we read some ancient Egyptian curses, which are are not exactly the same as the kinds that show up in our British literature. And we had our students write some of their own curses as well, just for fun in class. And we found out that while the Egyptians used and certainly believed in curses, we learned that the curses of our literature and films are more a product of the modern 19th century imagination than the Egyptian historical imagination.
And yet our students did write really astonishingly good curses.
They wrote very good curses, yeah.
Very detailed. Very, you don't want to ever not do the dishes if you're living in an apartment with any of our students because they have some serious curses for you.
Yeah.
So in our second week of discussing Jewel, as we were, talking about some of these important historical contexts, we began to learn more about the story of Queen Terah and about how her mummy and all of the things from her tomb somehow ended up in the home of our main characters, whose last name is Trelawney. How all of these things ended up in their house in London. We talked about how and why the novel is so lavish with its Egyptological knowledge. It is just packed full of information, some of it real, some of it fake, but nonetheless, it's very vested in presenting its readers with an enormous amount of what feels like quite learned up to the moment knowledge. And we talked especially about how this knowledge, this kind of performance of knowledge, is a way of the novel asserting its modernity and its authority. We also talked about the novel suddenly becoming a frame tale. As you might notice, I'm a little bit obsessed with frame tales. With our narrator suddenly kind of moving away from his own narration and telling us about a 16th century Dutch explorer's narrative that he's reading, about him telling us about other characters talking about their experiences with Queen Terah. And later, the main Egyptologist in the story, Mr. Trelawney, tells us his story about encountering and bringing Queen Terah back. And all of this information is filtered to us through a first-person narrator named Malcolm. So in tandem with this kind of sudden layering of stories and this distancing of readers from the actual stories being told, the novel also becomes really interested in withholding and transmitting knowledge. It's interested in who gets to read what, who gets to know which parts of this fairly complicated story, who gets to decide who knows what, and all of the pitfalls of various characters trying to operate when information is being deliberately withheld. Transmitting and withholding knowledge becomes a power play in the middle section of this novel. And the fact that information is always being mediated for readers, whether we are the readers or whether we're talking about readers within the novel, tells us that control over knowledge and information is a really important thematic aspect of the novel and one of the ways that it kind of navigates both gender and imperial power dynamics. And then in our last lecture on Jewel, well, maybe our last few lectures, we focus specifically on Queen Terah, who we finally see in the flesh for the first time as the Trelawney crew unwraps her in preparation for their great experiment, which is bringing her back to life. And I'm going to apologize because I'm going to give you some spoilers here, but it's not going to ruin your pleasure in reading the novel if you choose to. So we talked about all of the ways that Terah, as an ancient Egyptian female mummy, troubles various kinds of categorical boundaries between life and death, between ancient and modern, she and it, east and west, and a number of others, and how all of these porous boundaries somehow render her available to the men in the room as an erotic object. We talked a lot about the actual scene in which they the scene in which they unroll her, which is by far the most extreme example that we read in the class of mummy literature eroticizing the unrolling process. Stoker writes it almost as a kind of striptease. And finally, we talked about the fact that there are two different endings of this novel. So one ending, the original ending that Stoker wrote in 1903, and a second ending that he wrote later in 1906. So I'm trying to decide if I should tell you what the endings are. I'm just going to tell you what the endings are. In the original ending of this novel, everyone except our narrator dies. And Queen Tara runs off naked into the night to wreak havoc on the world. We don't really know what happens. And Malcolm's last line is, "It was merciful that I was spared the pain of hoping." So it's like a dark and really, really depressing ending. In the revised ending, written a few years later, Queen Tara just somehow vanishes into a pile of ash. Maybe she's absorbed into the one other female character in the text, Mr. Trelawney's daughter, Margaret, who happens to be an exact likeness, an exact double for Queen Tara. And then at the end, after Queen Tara magically somehow disappears, Malcolm and Margaret get married, everyone stays alive, and everyone lives happily ever after. So we discussed what endings do to novels, how they reorganize and shape everything that's come before, and how these two different endings fundamentally change how we understand the novel's politics, its critiques, and its interventions in the British imperial imagination. And then we took a little poll to see who liked what ending, and not surprisingly, our students were like, "We like the dark, depressing one."
So, our 19th century literature often included anxieties about and explorations of the impact of new technologies and scientific discoveries on the contemporary world. And we saw this a lot in Stoker's Jewel. The late 19th and early 20th century were moments of incredible technological breakthroughs, and we read together about the discovery of things like X-rays, the new inventions in lighting by Nikola Tesla, and the new understandings of radiation emerging from the work of Pierre and Marie Curie. We learned that mummies were key early studies for these new light technologies, with mummies already being X-rayed in 1896. And that perhaps surprising to us, ancient Egyptian culture and technology were associated with these new technologies. Technologies that were seemingly able to illuminate, to show things that were once invisible, and to transmute one substance to another through new forms of chemical reactions. And in this case, the change from death to life. Today, the connection between the mummy and new technologies is still very strong. And nearly every month, I read another article about a new DNA test or a CAT scan or other technology that is being applied to mummified human remains in museums. And we talked about the way that researchers hope to learn about the health, the cause of death, and things about the life experiences of people from their well-preserved remains. We also talked a lot about the larger ethical questions, the past and current practices around the interaction between modern humans and our deep ancestors force us to confront. So, in thinking about the ways that earlier generations, like the Victorians, dealt with human remains of people in the past, we asked if we could question our own present relationship with the dead. We talked about the question of whether or not the dead had rights in the present. We talked about acknowledging that our own present cultural biases and ideals can color our relationship with the dead as much as that of the Victorians. And these are important questions and have modern day implications for how our own museums and cultural institutions deal with human remains, not just from Egypt, but from all over the world.
So in the last few weeks of our class, we switched from mummy literature to mummy movies. And so in preparation for this, we spent some time talking about the relationship between 19th century Egyptomania and early moving picture technologies, some of which we've put up on the screen. And some of those technologies included the magic lantern and phantasmagoria shows that from the late 18th through the 19th century would project various kinds of moving images, ghosts, spirits, demons on screens for odd audiences. The moving panorama, and the earliest films and cinemas in the first decades of the 20th century. We focus primarily on various conceptual relationships between British ideas about ancient Egypt and ideas about early cinema, the ways that they both sort of constellated around mystery, the sort of light penetrating darkness, and various other ways that that for reasons related to what Elaine was suggesting about ancient Egypt's association with modern technology, Egypt became particularly associated with early cinema. We talked about the long 19th century history of representing Egypt in pre-cinematic moving picture technologies. And we talked about the cohabitation of Egyptian artifacts and one of the very first cinemas in Britain in the Egyptian Hall, where that tomb exhibition by Belzoni that Elaine mentioned a little bit earlier in the talk was also held in the 1820s. And and we also talked about the very large number of early movies that were mummy movies, especially in the years between 1901 and 1920.
We then viewed the first major blockbuster mummy movie, the 1932 movie with Boris Karloff as Ardith Bey and Imhotep, reanimated to try and find his lost love. And we looked together at how this film was drawing on the find in 1922, just a decade before the film was made, of the discovery of the boy king Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. And we looked at how the 1932 movie used imagery from the tomb, created plot points and settings reminiscent of the discovery in the valley, and how the real life media sensation around the tomb influenced the depiction of the ancient Egyptians and, of course, the idea of the mummy's curse. We also examined how the 1932 film included elements subtly critiquing the British colonial project in Egypt, and how Egyptian political nationalism following World War I was perhaps surprising to us, tied up with the idea of who owned the rights to the knowledge, imagery, and objects of King Tut's tomb. And indeed, instead of going to the British Museum or the private home of Lord Carnarvon in England, these objects stayed in Egypt. We jumped then decades ahead to the 1999 Mummy movie with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, and we looked at how that film drew on our earlier media, but also how the film focused on the materiality of the mummification process and Egyptian rituals in ways that I found really interesting. It included as major plot points and action and major sections of action in the film, things like the Book of the Dead, a series of canopic jars, and even the elaborate mummification ritual itself was incredibly important in the film. We then read and discussed real Egyptian funerary texts and talked about the Egyptian religious concepts regarding the eternal elements of the person. And we looked at the material process of mummification itself.
And then in our final week, we moved to more modern reimaginations of The Mummy. We watched the 2001 sequel to The Mummy Returns, and the 2017 Mummy movie. And in talking especially about The Mummy Returns, we talked about reanimation, again, not just as a key plot point in the movie, but also as a way of thinking about how the movie is both acknowledging the old conventions of mummy cinema that it's borrowing and attempting to revive them into something new. And there's a really wonderful scene towards the beginning of that movie where one of our main characters, Evie, is trying to convince her husband, Rick, Brendan Fraser, to go on an adventure with her, and she keeps trying to tell the story of this ancient oasis that she wants to explore, and he keeps filling in gaps in the story, and she keeps saying, "How do you know?" And he keeps saying, "That's how the story always goes." even as Evie continues to insist that, even though that's how the story always goes, they can change the way the story always goes. We critiqued various gendered character and plot elements in this movie. We talked about the ways that it brought multiple female characters in a way that hadn't happened in previous Mummy movies, and was really invested in the dynamics between them. We talked about the way that this film kind of shifted the genre of the imperial romance by making sure that all of the good characters had a hero moment instead of there just being one hero moment. And we also looked at the way the film includes new forms of commentary on the colonial relationship between the British Empire and indigenous communities, that it brings in various kinds of reanimated bodies that aren't specifically Egyptian, that are in fact quite explicitly not Egyptian, but are kind of borrowed from all over the global South. And so we discussed that the ways in which this imagery kind of allows the movie to broaden its colonial critique out of simply a critique of the relationship between Britain and Egypt, and into a much wider critique of the British colonial project at large.
And finally, we talked about what I think was a terrible movie, but super useful for our class, the 2017 Mummy movie with Tom Cruise. What I found very intriguing about this film is it offers a different example of the mummy narrative. It's not a straightforward recasting of a traditional mummy film. It's not actually set in Egypt. It's set in Iraq, and it's not centered on the British Empire of the 19th or early 20th century. It's set on set around the US invasion of Iraq in the Iraq War under George Bush. So instead, this film operates by taking a selection of some of the key elements of mummy media, things like anxiety about imperial exploration and violence in the lands of the non-European other, anxiety about the revenge of those others back on the homeland, and anxieties about gender and power, and frequently the exoticizing of the female body. And it takes all of those pieces and it remixes them. And so I see this film as an interesting critique of imperial adventure, colonial conquest, gendered structures, and violence against women's bodies, all of these themes that we had been talking about throughout the quarter, but having moved outside the boundaries of the literature and film in Egypt. These themes are being inscribed in new worlds, in new places, and within new historical moments, including the moment of now.
So in our very last class, we asked our students to talk about why, after all of these years, we're still reading mummy literature and still watching mummy films. And they had a lot of really interesting responses, but to us, maybe the two most profound and most convincing suggestions that they made was first that ancient Egypt is an ongoing historical and archaeological project. Things were being discovered in the 19th century. That was the kind of first flourishing of Egyptology as a discipline and as a practice. But all of that is also still going on today. There's still a lot of opportunities for new stories focused on mummies in ancient Egypt, because this isn't history that's over. This isn't history that's kind of done and dusted. It's still opening and changing, and there are always new discoveries kind of being offered in the world.
And then the second thing that our students pointed out to us was that the mummy is not really a specific character like Frankenstein or Dracula or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but instead the mummy is more of a category. And so it leaves a great deal of space for the imagination. It's not one specific person or monster. It's about a specific set of relationships or tropes that are more flexible and expansive and also even gender fluid. So we have all of these ways that the mummy can be reimagined as male or female in these very creative ways that perhaps are less limited than other characters like Frankenstein or Dracula.
And one of the ways we kind of talked about that question was by talking about the fact that the 2017 Mummy movie was supposed to be the first movie in a whole new dark universe series of monster movies that Universal was going to put out. And so we talked about why, why they would choose the Mummy as the kind of first of what was supposed to be this whole new monster series that of course didn't end up coming into being because that 2017 movie was so bad and did so poorly at the box office that they just scrapped the whole project. But kind of thinking about the idea that the Mummy, far more than these other characters, offered Universal an opportunity to really reimagine the entire world of its classic monster movies because it was so open and had so much flexibility.
So we're going to end there and open up to folks for questions and comments. Um, but one additional thing that we, of course, want to do, April said that for this series, you all could come to a class, but you didn't have homework. And so we're breaking with that tradition, and we are going to give you all homework to do. So if any of you are interested in reading your way through our class, you can just take a screenshot of this. This is our full listing of the British literature that our students made their way through this quarter, starting in the 1818 and making it through the 1920s. So these are all of the different stories. Most of these are short stories, and then there's the Bram Stoker Jewel of Seven Stars, which is a full novel. And then this is our listing of our mummy films that both short films, longer films, some which may be familiar to you, and then a couple that may be more surprising or things you haven't heard of before. So we hope that you will at least pick a few things from the genre and spend your holidays reading mummy literature.
Marvelous. Oh, do you want to continue with this?
Great. Should I just leave this slide up here, April, or
Yeah.
great.
And so usually we have an ask at the end of our slugs and steins to support research, a certain department, things that are going on at UCSC. And so Renee and Elaine have offered this. If you would like to make a donation to the Center for the Middle East and North Africa or the Center for Monster Studies at UC Santa Cruz, right now the best way is to contact Carrie Napoles, and her information is on this slide. And I believe there is a link available as well. It might be a little indirect, but we can share that in the chat.
Yeah, I think Shayna has a link, at least for donations to the Center of Monster Studies.
Okay. Well, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that information and how your class is formatted. And I know Van has put some comments in the Q&A box, and I was just curious. I think it's fascinating that you brought in Edward Said's Orientalism book and the ideas around Orientalism, because one of Van's questions is about how mummies are always portrayed as evil and scary, but never with good traits. And I'm thinking that's sort of like related to what you mentioned, as well as like othering, what we just don't understand, and having fear around, different cultures and their, I guess, practices. And so that was just interesting to note. And so have we ever seen mummies portrayed in a good or friendly way?
There are a couple of stories we read. One in particular by Grant Allen called My New Year's Eve with the Mummies, where the mummies are delightful. Like he want in whether or not this really happens or he's dreaming, it's a little bit unclear. It's a little bit of a comical story, but he wanders into a tomb on the one day out of every millennium that all the mummies wake up and have a party, and he's looking around. He's like, man, these people are way cooler than the English people that I've been hanging out with. And that mummy over there, that lady mummy, she especially is hot. I'm going to go talk to her. And then he has this like wonderful conversation with her, and she's so charming and wonderful. And he decides that he would like to himself be mummified so that he can spend his eternity waking up every 1,000 years to hang out with these mummies. And that, doesn't work out as he had planned. And his British fiance dumps him because he's such a jerk, because he spends so much time talking about how great this mummy lady he met was. So there are a few moments in which the mummies aren't necessarily evil, but the not evil mummies tend to be female mummies, and they tend to be highly sexualized figures. So even if, they aren't necessarily representing a kind of fear of the other, they are representing a kind of objectification of the other, and a kind of assumption that these characters who are supposed to be emblematic of these other cultures, of cultures that are exotic, or cultures that are foreign, or cultures that are simply other, that they can't simply just be people. Like they have to be kind of put in certain kinds of categories against which the British can define themselves, or even in this story, like the mummies are way more interesting than the British people that our narrator's hanging out with. But like the importance is difference. The importance is distinction, to be able to say like these are not British people. These are people, or these are objects or ideas that are different.
Interesting. So we have a number of questions here that go to the characteristics of mummies, and what defines them, and just how many there are. So how many mummies, real mummies, are there have been found? Do they tend to be more men than women? Do they all get done up, wrapped, preserved, etc. in the same way, or can you fall into a bog in Ireland and become a mummy and be considered be considered in the same way?
Yeah, there's so many different examples. So there's not one way to be a mummy. Also, ancient Egypt is not the only place that only culture that mummifies humans in the world. So there's also other parts of the world where people are mummified using slightly different processes, and are wrapped in different ways. Their bodies are treated very differently. So the Egyptian case is one very specific type of case. Egyptian corpses were dealt with in various different ways over the many centuries of the Egyptian pharaonic period, and then into the Greek and Roman periods. So different technologies evolved, different religious ideas come to the fore. Also, depending on how much cash you had as a person, if you were really an elite, you could have a very elaborate form of mummification that might take up to 70 days. Whereas if you were a poor person, you may wrap your deceased family member in a reed mat, and do the best you could with the kinds of resources that you had. So there's many, many different ways of mummification. Both men and women were mummified, as well as children. And also animals were mummified. And I don't know if everyone knows that, but there's actually, a number of tombs, sort of rock cut tomb chambers at the site of Saqqara, which I wrote my book on, and discovered in there are millions of mummified animals, dogs,
Oh,
cats, ibises, crocodiles, millions. So the Egyptians were also mummifying animals as votive offerings to the gods, and depositing them in these religious spaces in these sacred necropolises. So the Egyptians are using mummification in lots of different ways. So there's no one way for me to answer that question, because there's so much variety in the way that that mummification is being used across the thousands of years in which people are mummified in Egypt.
so just to follow up, millions of animals, millions of people as well?
That's a good question. I would guess that if you added up all of the mummies over time that had been discovered in Egypt, probably yes.
Wow.
One of the problems that we have now is that these kinds of practices of grinding up mummies, of using mummified body parts for things like fertilizer, for other kind of processes, those have destroyed a huge number of the original mummified bodies. But there certainly were what we would call like mass tombs or mass graves, where, you know, hundreds of different of people whose bodies had been treated in some way approximating mummification had been found in the 19th century together. But many of those pits had been, by the end of the 19th century, had been completely cleared. So we don't know now. People didn't write all of this information down like archaeologists do now. So we really have, it's very difficult for us to get a sense of how many bodies were actually talking, and people didn't say how many were men and how many were women. The kinds of scientific questions that now would be extremely interesting to us, people didn't write down then.
And just to follow up the last part of the question you asked, David, about whether or not bog bodies in Ireland could be considered mummies and whether or not that was something, you know, that we dealt with in this class. You know, we were focused specifically on Egypt, but I would imagine that the person who asked that question was maybe thinking about Seamus Heaney's Bog People poems. And the way that Heaney is kind of, you know, looking at these very, very, very well preserved bodies that are coming out of these bogs and using that preservation as an occasion to kind of poetically imagine these bodies and these people and these cultures back to life, and using that kind of imagining of these cultures back to life as a way to quite explicitly connect the violences of the past with the violences of the present. And that's something that I think we see a lot of in mummy literature, you know, about specifically Egyptian mummies, but, you know, those bog bodies for Heaney are doing a lot of the same work that mummies do for 19th century authors, you know, the preservation as an occasion to imagine a past to life that that maybe other kinds of artifacts or antiquities don't inspire.
And Elaine, you mentioned religion briefly. Carrie is wondering, did your class discuss the role of religion in the narratives and historical contexts?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about Egyptian religion, thinking about ancient Egyptian religion, and then Renée also talked a bit about Victorian concepts around esoteric ideas about religion and their own ideas on incorporating ancient Egyptian sort of imaginations into Victorian ideals. I'll let you say something about that, Renée.
So one of the things that we ended up talking about was Victorian spiritualism and the kind of seance craze in the 1850s and then again in the 1880s, and the way that various kinds of Egyptian iconography and kind of quite bastardized Egyptian mythology became a part of the spiritualist toolbook, and how the kind of, you know, interest and obsession in whether or not, you know, the dead could live again, that people associated with Egypt, like how this kind of effloresced in these seances where women were supposedly channeling, you know, channeling these dead spirits and producing various kinds of material emanations like ectoplasm, and so we, you know, we talked about how kind of Victorian interest in death, Victorian interest in kind of alternatives to traditional religions, kind of brought Egypt into the conversation. And we talked about Arthur Conan Doyle specifically. So, you know, creator of Sherlock Holmes, you know, the most rational detective ever, who you know, but Arthur Conan Doyle was also obsessively interested in spiritualism. He was a true believer. He wrote an entire book supporting the authenticity of fairy photographs in the beginning of the 19th century, insisting that these fairies were clearly real. And when you look at these photographs, the fairies are clearly not real. He fully believed that his son, who died in World War I, could be accessed through spiritualist mediums. Like, you know, he was really, really invested in these questions of spiritualism while he was also writing a number of mummy stories. So there are important connections between these kinds of alternative Victorian religious practices, their kind of interest in death and ghosts and spirituality, and the kind of language and trappings of ancient Egypt.
So Jean has an interesting point about the ethics questions that you pointed out. It points out that an anthropologist at San Jose State got into trouble by not asking the questions and disrespecting the ancestors' remains. On those ethical questions, so they were heavy-duty ones from my perspective, how do you stand? How would you answer them?
Yeah, so I was more interested with the students in having them discuss and talk about where what they think the appropriate way for modern people to deal with human remains is. And we, talked about the different points of view in terms of access to medical knowledge, that archaeologists are very interested in being able to find out things about non-elite people. And in ancient Egypt, most non-elite people weren't able to write. Literacy was an extremely elite part of society. You don't have an alphabet of 26 letters, you have to learn hundreds of hieroglyphs. It's not a simple system. So human bodies and archaeology are one of the few ways we can get access to the non-elite people's lives, and we can learn things about them from the careful study of their mummified human remains. And so there's a bit of a push and pull there that this is one of our access points into a whole group of people who are normally not represented in the historical record. But we now have a lot of ethical questions about, is that appropriate? How should we be treating these bodies? And so those are questions I can't answer. That's above my pay grade. I can't tell everyone what to do. But I can, I do want our students to think about those questions and for us to talk about those and have an active discussion of them in our class.
Okay, so I have to think more. Before you go, April, just to remind our audience, it would be very helpful if you upvoted questions that are there and also add new questions. So look through the questions listed and upvote, please.
And Renee,
Yeah,
did you have any?
sorry, April. I'd love to answer Zach Zimmer's question.
Yeah.
He asked, what lessons can today's Silicon Valley billionaires who want to live forever learn from the Victorian necromantics and the ancient Egyptians that they loved? And I would say that what I learned from reading our Victorian literature this quarter is that what you think you're going to get when you hope to reanimate yourself or live forever is usually not what you bargained for. Things usually go very, very wrong, at least in Victorian literature. So I would say the real lesson learned is beware.
Zach, pass it on.
Do you have anything to add, Renee?
Oh no, I think Elaine is totally right about that. Like, it never goes the way you expect it to.
Good to know. Van has a question. Has anyone been mummified alive? And is it a privilege to be mummified?
I mean, they are in movies.
There's a lot of that happening in movies. That seems so much less likely because to be mummified, they have to actually take out all of your juicy body parts. So basically they have to remove, to really mummify you, they remove your all of your interior organs, they take them out, they treat them in salt, in natron, they package them in a separate way. In some periods of Egyptian history, they'll put them back in your body. In other periods, they put them in these canopic jars. Your heart is wrapped, but then placed back in. Your brain is just, they pluck it out and leave it. It's not useful. So you couldn't actually be mummified alive because you would have died, you'd have bled out. So, were people ever sort of buried alive, or like I guess maybe like once or twice maybe, but that was not normally a process. We do have court cases from ancient Egypt where people have transgressed against Pharaoh. So there's a case in the New Kingdom where there's a conspiracy where all of these people plan to kill the king, and maybe they succeeded, and including a number of his wives who have decided to off him so that their own sons can take the throne. And what we see happen is when you've committed a crime like that, you are tried, you are convicted, and then you are allowed to commit suicide, or they will kill you. So there's no discussion of them like mummifying people alive or burying them alive. They off you, and then maybe you don't get mummified as a punishment. But mummification it's expensive. It's something you would have had to plan for, or your family would have had to plan for. So in terms of like, is it a privilege? Sort of, yes, because you would need to have the privilege of wealth and the privilege of access to get access to that material.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Jane again. Mummification seems a predecessor to Western mortuary science. True?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know how to say if predecessor. I mean, certainly, it was, we would consider it a sort of science, right? The Egyptians are studying the human body. They are learning things about the way that the body works from the fact that they are dissecting the body. So in the period that Renée is a specialist in, right, we see all of these people in medical science are doing they're doing dissecting, and they're doing it in order to learn more about the human body. And so corpses become really important. And there's all of these new laws that come into Britain in the 19th century about whose bodies get to be dissected and who gets to dissect. And there's this real problem with not having enough corpses for all of these medical students to learn on. So indeed, I don't know if the Egyptians are, they're not mummifying in order to learn more about the human body, but they certainly do learn about the human body from that process. And that kind of knowledge, I think, then translates into Egyptian medicine in a larger way.
And I mean, so one of the things that the Victorians were especially interested in, so well, not just the British Victorians, but people in the West across the 19th century. The mid 19th century is when embalming as a Western practice really came to the fore. So so there was an interest in the ways that bodies, might and might not be able to be preserved, that I think was kind of part and parcel of people's fascination with mummies. And the idea that, even though people were well aware that when you unwrapped a mummy, you didn't see someone who looked like a, plump, fleshy person who had just gone to sleep, like you see a, desiccated corpse, but the possibility that embalming could, maybe produce a version of a corpse that, that maintained itself, that continued to look alive for longer than it naturally should. It kind of cast, or sort of related to the interest in writing versions of mummy stories in which the bodies being unwrapped somehow looked like they were, just barely dead or still alive. The In the US and in Britain in the 19th century, fairly quickly after photography kind of was invented in the 1840s, they started a practice called posthumous mourning photography, where as soon as possible after a loved one died, they would be posed for a photograph, um, posed to look as much as possible like they were sleeping or like they were still alive. And a photograph would be taken, and that photograph would quite often be displayed in people's homes. And there was a kind of superstitious sense that if you could get a photograph taken soon enough after somebody died, you could actually capture a little bit of their remaining spirit in the photograph. So by holding on to the photograph, you were holding on to their spirit, but also, by having a photograph of a dead loved one that almost kind of maybe looked like they were still alive. It was a way of continuing to imagine that they, their presence remained. It was a way of kind of imaginatively preserving a body that in reality was obviously decaying somewhere underground. But that, that photograph kind of captured that exact moment that people thought was kind of right between life and death, right before a corpse would begin to decay, and you could preserve it that way in this new technological medium. So there was a lot of interest in the 19th century in what you could do with a dead body to keep it from kind of dissolving into nothingness.
Fascinating. There's a question from Helga. How has the research into mummification, the mummification process and the DNA analysis of the materials and biological items associated with the bodies advanced our knowledge of the particular cultures in which these mummies were found?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I guess one way I could cite right now is specifically looking at the mummification process. There have been a number of new sort of recent discoveries. I think maybe just last year, a group of Egyptologists published an article about the mummification and embalming workshop that was discovered at Saqqara. And in that embalming workshop were a series of vessels that had still the remains of the chemicals that were sealed inside these vessels that were meant to be part of the embalming process for mummification. And these were labeled on the exterior with in Egyptian language. And so a series of scholars did chemical analysis on these materials and could find, where were these materials coming from? So things like juniper oil, cedar oil, beeswax, other kinds of materials that would have been used in the process. And what they found through modern chemical analysis was that these materials were actually coming from all over the Mediterranean. So, like, what is the Mediterranean coast of like Tunisia, Morocco, Spain, Italy, Greece, all the way up to what is now modern Syria and Turkey. And then there were even chemicals that would have been coming from India and from South and West Africa. So it shows us the kind of trade networks that were being produced in order for the Egyptians to get access to these materials. And so it's like an amazing globalization 1.0 moment, right? Where we see that the Egyptians are importing these things and trading with people from all over around the ancient Mediterranean, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. Because these materials are valuable to them. And so it shows us something really interesting about the Egyptian economy, about long distance trade, and just from, a couple of vessels with these materials found underground at Saqqara. So we can really learn a lot of things with doing these kinds of new chemical analyses of this type of material.
So I have to follow up with a question. How much of the original DNA of the body, as opposed to the oil surrounding it, is identifiable by researchers?
Yeah. So, that's actually a question for my colleague at UCSC, Lars Fahrenschrift. We have an ancient DNA lab on our campus. I don't know if a lot of people know that. And so Lars and his graduate students do ancient DNA analysis on human remains all over the world. And so I have asked him this question many times, like how good how much does the mummification process interfere with DNA? And he has told me, and so I'm just relaying what he has said to me, that in some cases it interferes a lot, and in other cases less. So he said it can be very much a case by case basis on whether or not you can actually get good DNA out of mummified materials. Certainly there's a number of projects that have done DNA analysis on the royal mummies from Egypt, and who, suggest that they're able to actually create sort of family trees of, relationships that this person was a son or a daughter, or maybe a cousin, like things like that, so that we can actually see a bit of like who in this group was related to each other, who might have been King Tut's father, those kinds of questions. There are cases where, people seem to think that type of DNA work can be done well, but I am not an expert in that. And so I'm afraid I only, can answer that question secondhand.
David, did you want to ask the next question?
Oh, well, actually, there's a comment, and I will, so this is from Daniela, a suggestion. If anybody's interested in Egyptology Museum right in our backyard, the Rosicrucian Museum in San Jose is really nice. There's a link there. Any comments about the museum?
Have you been, Renee?
I haven't been. It is weird and wacky. One of our TAs this quarter went, and she said that there was an AI version of Thoth, one of the Egyptian gods, and you could like ask it questions and like talk to it. And that she was both completely fascinated, but also like a little bit creeped out. But I think that one of the things she did with her students is like have them have them decide what they would ask the AI Thoth if they came in contact with it. So and I think she offered them some extra credit if they decided to go. But I mean, everything I've heard about it is amazing. I feel like ridiculous that I haven't gone.
Yeah, and unfortunately, right now it's closed, but UC Berkeley also has a very large collection of Egyptian objects that were excavated from around 1900 to about 1904 under the patronage of Phoebe Hearst. And so there's like, I think 17,000 Egyptian objects from those years excavated by George Reisner that are in the Bay Area.
Cool. Pranav has a question, and it might be the last one, but I was very curious. What is the format of an Egyptian curse? If we have time, I would love to hear about that. So Pranav says, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the emergence of the historian and history as part of the plot. I was taught that the modern historical novel began during the period of this course with Scott's Waverley, but the Jewel of the Seven Stars is different. It's sort of like a docent ran amok in the narrative. Is that part of Victorian scientism applied to modern historiography, Orientalism, or just Stoker?
That is a wonderful question and feels like a question that the head of our Humanities Institute would certainly ask. So yes, absolutely. The modern historical novel did begin with Scott in the early part of the 19th century, and the mummy novels that we were reading are quite interested in the historical novel as a genre, even as they're trying to do something quite a bit different. So one of the things that you see in Scott novels is this idea that the historical novel by kind of having a main protagonist who is fairly mediocre can kind of show us a narrative of progress that gets us from in Scott's case sort of uh, much older Scottish history forward to the contemporary 19th century moment of Scotland, all kind of channeled through this protagonist who maybe doesn't himself have a huge effect on history. The point of those novels is to kind of show us the onward march of progress and show us the way that understanding our past history, especially our past national history, can help us imagine what our nation looks like in the present moment. What we see in these mummy novels, especially in a novel like Stoker's, is is a set of British characters who are in some ways trying to do something similar to what Scott does, to look back at an ancient culture, to try to retrieve ancient knowledge and use that ancient knowledge to kind of imagine a better present. But in the case of mummy novels, it's not their own national history that they're attempting to access. It's somebody else's history. So the Egyptologists in the Stoker novel are really invested in the idea that Queen Terra is a bearer of all sorts of historical knowledge that nobody has had access to, and that if they can just get her knowledge, if they can just wake her up and take everything she knows, they're going to be able to create a better version of Britain. That somehow this ancient Egyptian knowledge is going to be their pathway to a kind of new British national culture. And of course, the danger or the trouble in mummy knowledge is like that knowledge doesn't belong to you. That queen doesn't want to give you her stuff. It doesn't belong to you. You don't own it. And the kind of assumption of ownership becomes one of the central problems or the central kind of like producers of tension and danger in those texts. So it also kind of maybe allows us to look back at historical novels like Scott novels and say, okay, like in what ways are those novels too maybe appropriating histories in ways that are not necessarily ethical, or in ways that are not maybe attendant to the demands or the necessities of those actual pasts. Like in what ways might historical novels be doing something um not quite as obviously gothic or dangerous or appropriative or violent, but like maybe they're operating on a similar model. So to me, mummy novels actually help us see historical novels and help us to see sort of lots of different cultural revival projects that were extant at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century through a slightly different lens, and maybe allows us to see the ways in which that kind of historical revival might have its downsides, or might have its negatives, or might have its dangers.
Wow. Well, thank you both very much. Let's have a big round of applause for Professors Fox and Sullivan. Now, Elaine and Renee are two of our veteran speakers here in Slugs and Steins. 4 and 6 years, respectively, ago. They held wonderful programs then and have been asked to return because of their success. Thank you for sharing your time. Now, they mentioned the support. They would love that you support their work. And there is a link, hopefully. If you can't find that link, write to us or write to the Humanities Institute and demand it. I'd also like to pass on another big round of thanks to the staff of the Alumni Relations and the Special Events Office. They're in the background here tonight: Shana, Diana, Paulina. And we're coming back. We're going to take a break in January, but we'll be kicking off our 8th year on February 10th. Oh, I said 6 years, didn't I, Renee? But it was 8 years ago. We're kicking off on February, okay, 6, with a star professor, Anne Kapuscinski, who will speak on coastal resilience. Now, Anne is the Environmental Studies Department. Is in the Environmental Studies Department and is Director of Coastal Science and Policy Program. As an interdisciplinary scholar, she is committed to finding scientifically and socially robust solutions to a major challenge: how to perpetuate healthy aquatic ecosystems while sustaining resource uses that can support human well-being. Her recent research has focused on aquaculture. Well, meanwhile, UCSC Events has much in store. You can join arts and music departments on the campus and get into holiday spirits on Friday, December 13th, with the music, dance, and storytelling of A Celtic Christmas. That story recreates the joy and innocence of the night before Christmas in a remote farmhouse in the west of Ireland in the 1950s. Then, on January 6th, in Santa Clara and online, there will be a crawl lecture titled Marine Mammal Science and Sanctuaries in California Coastal Water. Information on these events and more are found at calendar.ucsc.edu. So on behalf of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association, thank you so much for joining us. And please come back on Monday, February 10th at 6:30 p.m. for our next virtual event.
Thank you.